Today I'm going to be showing you 5 Lightroom tools that we all have access to, but if you can learn to use them, you will dramatically improve your photography. And so the way that I'm going to do this is I've gone through some of my old photo archives. I've selected some really terrible images from 7-8 years ago that I never processed, because at the time when I was using Lightroom, I just couldn't get the images the way that I wanted them to look. But by learning these tools, I can now create a better image than I could back then. I'm showing you these 5 tools because I wish I had seen this video 5 years ago, for example. So I hope that by watching this video, you will learn something new and you will be able to improve your editing, which will improve your photography with time as well. For now, I am going to be using, as I said, some images from my past that had terrible exposures, bad composition, and probably shouldn't be used for anything, but I'm going to show you how editing them can really bring a new light to them, especially by using these 5 tools. Now, the first tool for today is the crop tool. Everyone can see the crop tool is up here. This is the crop tool. You can change the aspect ratio of the crop tool, which is really useful, and it's one of my preferred methods for changing how an image looks. I'll get onto that in a minute, but let's just talk about the crop tool for a minute, because we are removing megapixels from the image. We are lowering the resolution of the image because we're taking away those megapixels. But it really doesn't matter unless you're going to be making it big. So let's show you what the crop tool can do to a composition. So I've got this image here from Norway. I went to Norway in 2014. Wonderful trip in the winter. I would highly recommend it. This image on its own is terrible. There's no foreground, it's very dark. I underexposed by like 2 stops for some unknown reason that I can't remember. I think the snow was quite bright and I was trying to make sure I got those highlights, but as you can see on the histogram over here, I have massively underexposed it. Now, I really like the clouds in the sky. The mountain is beautiful. There's a little bit of side light catching on these ridges. I do wish that I had a better exposure, but this sea in the foreground is really flat and boring and there's nothing of interest here. So why not just eliminate all of that sea from the image? It's not doing anything, and that's where the crop tool can come in handy, because just by going to a 1:1 ratio, I can move it up, eliminate the majority of that boring sea, bring the peak into the central square, and boom, you're immediately brought into the image. You can see the mountains more clearly. There's a lot less foreground to be distracting you, and you've still got this very dramatic sky above it. Now, I went on to process this image a bit more, and I'm not going to walk through that right now. I'm just going to show you the end result of how I like the image to look. So you can see from this one, by converting it to black and white, I've made the texture of the snow stand out against the dark rocks. It's a very high contrast image. And I've also introduced a lot of drama into the sky. And now I would actually happily have this in my portfolio as a really nice image of a snowy mountain. The only issue is it's not completely in focus, I don't think. It's just slightly soft, but not too bad. Okay, so just by changing it to a 1:1 aspect ratio, I brought you into the image more, and you can see that composition much better. So the next one is from Athens. Again, this was around 2014, I think, or 2013. And it's a view from the Acropolis, I think, looking out over the city of Athens. And it's not a bad image. It's well exposed, as you can see in the histogram. No highlights, clips, and it's got a good range. And you can see all of the cloud in the sky, which is quite nice, adds a bit more. But there's this blue gap up here, which is just not adding anything, and it's creating a lot of negative space. So again, if we use the crop tool, and instead of going to a 1:1, we're going to go to a 16:9 and just bring it down and remove that blue space, and already that image is much better. You've got this expanse of buildings in front of you, leading to these hills that stick up like islands in a sea of urban life. You've got the clouds still visible, but you're just losing that negative space. I could refine that a bit more, unlock it, and really go a bit closer if I wanted to. But just by cropping in a little bit, you create a more dynamic image. And the last one we're going to look at is this red grouse picture. That must be from 2013, and I mean, it's not bad. This was on a 5D2, to be honest. It's a little soft, but you can see the reflection in the eye, and that's quite good. I think with a little sharpening it will look better, but there's this distracting element down here. Now, this element is really annoying to me, at least. And there's a lot of negative space around the animal. I think I had it on the central focus point, and I wanted to get that on the eye. And that's why there's so much negative space, and she's very central to the frame. But again, if I use the crop tool, I'm not going to change the aspect ratio for this one. But if I just bring it down like this, I can get her eye on the an intersection on the thirds, and already you're getting closer to the animal just by cropping in, and that can really be good for wildlife photography. The crop tool is one of my favorite tools when I'm doing wildlife editing, because often you might be a bit further away that you want to be, and that can be useful. You can shoot wide knowing that you can crop in later, and that can really make an image stand out. And so here's a finished image where I've just done a bit more processing, sharpened it a bit, and it's a bit clearer. I don't know about going in my portfolio, but it's a nice image, I think. The main impact though is that cropping in. My next tool, actually, that's funny. So for this image, I would actually want to reduce the greens saturation because they're a little bit distracting. And the next tool that I want to talk about is the HSL panel down here. This panel is incredibly useful for color photography, and it can really help you bring out a different style to your photography, especially if you're into sort of that retro look. This is the panel where you achieve that. For the HSL panel, you have two options. You can have it like this, where it's divided by hue, saturation, and luminance, which is great, but I find it a little distracting having all this information. I prefer to work by color, like this. So I just select orange. Brilliant. I want to work on the oranges in this image, or as in the case of this red grouse image, I want to actually work on the greens. The greens are a little distracting to me. So I select green. Now the hue slider, that changes the color of the green. I'll show you what I mean. Because if I go to the left of the hue slider, it's going to bring it more towards the yellow end of green. And if I move it to the right of the hue slider, it takes it to the aqua end of the green. But obviously I don't really want to affect the hue. In fact, I'm going to reduce the hue just a little bit because the surroundings are very yellow and the green is quite distracting because of that brightness. So I've reduced the hue. I've brought it down towards the yellow spectrum, and that's just giving it a nice, more blended approach with the surroundings. Now the saturation is exactly the same as this saturation up here, except for the fact you're targeting one particular color. So saturation is, how do I put this? Saturation is how much color you can see. So if I go to the right, it makes it really quite very dark and a lot of green, yeah? But if I go to the left, it goes to gray. And that's because I'm removing the color completely from the image. So I do want to desaturate these greens a little bit because again, they're very distracting. The last one is luminance. Now luminance is to do with brightness. How bright are the colors appearing? So if I go that way, they look very bright, very high highlighted, you know? And if I go this way, they're very dark. I actually want to brighten these a bit because I think it will fit in with the surroundings a bit more. If I go dark, it makes them contrasting to their environment. So I'm going to brighten it just a wee bit. And already those greens in the image are a little bit less distracting, in my opinion. This is all my opinion. So if I reset, you can see that's what they were like. And the greens, I think, are a lot less distracting there. So if you're struggling with saturation in your images, go to the HSL panel and experiment with targeting saturation of individual colors. And I think you'll be surprised with how they turn out. One of the key issues I was having with my editing of my images was that I was working too globally. So I would adjust mainly that basics panel. And if that wasn't working out, I'd sort of give up on the image and move on. What I should have been doing is working more locally. Now the HSL panel is an example of working a bit more locally. You're isolating particular colors and just adjusting the saturation and the luminance of those colors instead of affecting the whole color range, which is what the global saturation and vibrance does. So the next step to take that far forward and to really work locally is the tools at the top of the screen. Honestly, I didn't even know these existed when I was starting to edit, but when I found these and I really tried to work hard on them, I dramatically improved my editing. And they are the first port of call for me in most circumstances now. So this is the tool we're going to be talking about now. It's the brush, and it is fantastic. Honestly, it's one of the best tools for creating different style of images, for targeting specific areas of images, and really working locally to adjust different parts of the image. What can you do with the brush tool? What can't you do with the brush tool should be the question, because you can do everything. You've got these presets come with Lightroom. The ones that I use most often are burn, just simple darkening. It reduces the exposure. Dodge increases the exposure. Darken and dehaze, it just adds a bit of dehaze to that brush. But what I tend to do, to be honest, is actually use those as a starting point and then adjust these values for myself. And that's the best thing you can do, because you can create your own presets that you can save and use in other images, and you can see how each individual setting can affect an area of a select image. So let's dive into this image here from Glencoe in 2014, I think. Again, a little bit underexposed, not too much though. I've just avoided hitting the highlights, but it was quite a dark and dingy day, and this area of the water is very bright. So if I show you the finished image, you can see I've really changed the exposure because it was a bit brighter. I've also cropped it in a little bit because I didn't like this bush here on the left-hand side, and I think it really brings you into this waterfall. I did do some basic. I increased the exposure by 1 stop. But the biggest impact on this image was the brushes. I used 3 brushes to adjust this image from this to this. And they were a top brush for the sky. You can see it here. This is where it's affecting. I reduced the exposure, reduced the temperature to make it a bit bluer. I decreased the highlights and I increased the shadows in this select area. So if I actually, let's say I delete this, look how bright that sky is. But by bringing it back in, you can see I've brought in a bit more drama. Because I increased the exposure globally, it meant the sky was just white. But by adding that brush, reducing the saturation, increasing the dehaze, reducing the clarity, and reducing the temperature. There's a lot of stuff going on in this brush. I've brought back the drama that was in the original image. This drama here, the dehaze slider, you can see what that does there. That's probably the most useful tool part slider in this brush, and then I actually decreased the clarity, and that's because it makes the clouds a bit softer. When you use the dehaze tool, it can make it a bit blocky. It's not so much in this image, but it can make your clouds a bit blocky. So by reducing the clarity, it just brings back that softness that clouds should have. So that's brush 1. Brush 2, you can see where I put it. It's on these rocks, on this part of the landscape and on this part of the landscape, and that was to just increase the exposure a wee bit. If I delete it again, it doesn't look too bad, but by adding that brush and just bringing out the definition of those rocks and making them a bit more prominent. So I just increase the exposure by 0.4 stops, increase the contrast, increase the highlights and increase the whites and increase the dehaze. And all of those things is about bringing out the bright areas of the image. The last brush I used was on the water. Literally, I just went along and followed the water here. And what I did was I decreased the highlights, increased the contrast and increased the dehaze quite a lot. And that's so you can see the streaks through the water a lot more. Where I had increased the exposure, these were just white and very blocky. So you can actually see the definition in the water and it's not as big a distraction. So that's how the brush tool can be used to improve a photo. And it is one of the best tools in Lightroom. If you only learn one tool from this tutorial, it has to be the brush tool. The other tools, don't worry about as much as the brush tool. That is the one that will significantly improve your images because you're targeting specific areas of the image and not working globally. That's it. That's how you improve your images. That's what sets a lot of photographers apart. They do this sort of work, but in Photoshop, which is a lot more complicated. I might do something about it in the future, but I'm not an expert in Photoshop, to be honest. I do most of my editing in Lightroom and go to Photoshop for certain things. And I'm trying to learn more, but it's really complicated, as I'm sure you know. So I hope you can see how the brush tool can really dramatically improve your images. The next tool number 4 in this 5 tools for Lightroom video is the gradient filter tool. Now what the gradient filter tool does is very similar to the brush tool. In fact, it's the exact same panel. You can do everything the same that you can do with a brush tool that you can do with a gradient filter tool. Instead of where the brush you have to paint it into the areas where you want it to, a gradient filter tool affects like a block. You tell it where you want it and it affects everything in that area of the image. Now this can be really useful in high contrast areas. So if we take a look at this image here in Lightroom, this was in Scotland in 2014 as well. You can see like the sky is actually quite bright. There's a lot of, I'm pointing at the screen instead of using my mouse. There's a lot of, it was quite a bright day. There's a good amount of sun on this part of the hill, but that meant that this whole area is in very dark shadow. Now I tried to create a balance at the time with my exposure, but it was quite a difficult thing to do. There's also quite a horrible blue color cast to this image. I don't know what that was. This is what the image looked like, and this is my finished edit. You can see I brought back a lot of that shadow, so you can actually see the subject of this river with these stones as a foreground. But if I worked globally and increased the exposure globally, this would all be horribly burnt out. So what I did instead was I used graduated filters, one going up the bottom and one coming down from the sky. And the one from the bottom, which is this one, increased the exposure by over a stop and lifted the shadows. And if I turn it on and off, so that's it on, off, you can see how much of an improvement that made to the image. You can see how much that has made a difference to the image. I've instantly brought out the subject. You can actually see what's going on. And then this one, for the sky, I changed the temperature to a bit more yellow, but I reduce the highlights, increase the dehaze, reduce the saturation. This is quite a complicated one, a bit like the brushes. And what that has, where I've applied it to the sky, that's just made this light a bit more yellow, a bit more golden, as if it's been taken in the golden hour instead of the middle of the day. And it's just made the clouds a bit better, a bit more defined. So I find these really useful if you've got this sort of high contrast area to affect one select part of the image. Good thing about the grad filter tools is you can use a brush with them as well. So let's say, for example, I'm using this sunny brush, this sunny gradient filter here. If I show you the mask, you can see it there. And I want this grad filter to be applied down here as well as the top, let's say. So I can actually just brush it in. So there you go. You can see I'm actually applying it down here as well. If I take it away, makes it very orange down there. That's actually not, it doesn't look too bad, but it doesn't look right either. The other thing that you can do with the grad filter is, and the brush tool together, so I'm in the grad filter, I've got this sky one selected, but I don't want it all down here. This is actually annoying me. I can choose the brush and then erase, and I can remove it from wherever I don't want this filter to appear. Let's say I don't want it on this bush up here, I can remove it. And that can really help you select the right areas of your image to have the grad filter on. The last tool that I want to talk about, it specifically is useful with the grad filter and the brush filter. So this last tool is not actually a tool in and of itself. Instead, it's a way for you to better define the use of your brush and your grad filter, and it's luminance masking. So luminance masking is a complicated technique in Photoshop, but you can do a sort of rudimentary version in Lightroom, and it affects your grad filters, your radial filter, and your brush. Essentially, wherever you're applying a mask to your image. Now, a mask is just a layer that affects certain areas. It's not the global adjustments to an image. So that's what the brush and the grad tools do. Now, the luminance mask, what it is targeting is brightness of pixels. So you can tell it to adjust bright pixels or dark pixels, and it selects only those pixels in that area. This is getting complicated. In that area, and adjusts them using that filter. In this sky, in this foreground, for example, let's go with the foreground first. If I turn off the luminance mask, you can see it's too much bright. It's too bright. This is all very bright. And it makes it look a bit fake, to be honest, because you do need some shadows in your image, especially where there's bright sun. You can see like the gradient filter comes up from the bottom and sort of tapers out here towards the top, but it's too much. So what I did instead was I applied a luminance mask, and you can see it's only affecting certain parts of the image. If I show you the mask, you can see it works in the darker areas more and less in the lighter areas. And that's how you can use a luminance mask to better refine where the filter is being applied. If I show the luminance mask, you can see. So the way that the computer works out, or Lightroom works out which areas to affect, is it converts the image to black and white, and it then can tell the difference in the grayscale of which areas are bright and which areas are dark. Without a luminance mask, where it's set to 0 and 100 here, it's affecting the whole image. It's affecting the whole area. But I don't want that. I want it to only affect the darkest parts of the areas, because the brightest parts are actually okay. So I'm going to reduce this slider, working towards the dark end of the range. And you can see it's affecting the really dark areas of the image more. And then this smoothness, what that does is it helps to blend it into the image. If I've got it down to 0, watch this, this is horrible. You can see that it's, with the smoothness down at 0, is really blocky and undefined. But by increasing that smoothness, it just blends the image together much better. Okay, the darkest areas have the most effect, but then these lighter areas have a sort of a light dusting of the filter, and that makes it just look a bit more real. I also did the same thing with this sky filter here. So if I click on the luminance mask, you can see I made it go to the really bright end of the spectrum, this 89 to 100 part of the spectrum, and that means it's only affecting the brightest parts of the area. I kept my smoothness at 50. Now if I move that down to 0, you can see that it's only affecting this select area. If I turn it off, it doesn't look too bad, to be fair. But by having that smoothness, it's affecting the whole image, but just at different opacities. That's what that does. So the luminance mask can be really useful in helping you to define it. So with this luminance masking, you can use it with a brush. Let's say I'm going to add a dodge brush to this area here. All down here you can see it coming brighter as I brush it in. Okay, you can see where I've brushed in. I want to now add a luminance mask and go right down to the very darkest areas, and no smoothing for whatever reason. And that means that only those very dark areas of the image are being affected by the brush that I just applied. The other way that this can be used is, let's go to this red grouse picture. I'm going to add a blue tint, right? This is just a very drastic example to show you what you can do with it. So you can see I'm going to paint it in this area, and now it's very blue in that area. As I say, I'm just showing you the possibilities. But what you can do is use this masking tool to affect color. You get a little eyedropper, and I'm going to select this green area. And now it is affecting only the color that I've selected. You can see it there. So whereas before it was affecting the whole area, I'm giving this blue tint, I've now only added blue to the greens. And that can be a really useful way of targeting different areas of your image as well. But obviously I don't want this brush on there. So that luminance masking and color masking is just a really simple way that you can target specific bright values or color values in your image, and it means that you can really target specific areas of your image. Now there is that more advanced technique in Photoshop, which is luminosity masking, where you have to use an actual plugin to help you create these layers. It's really complicated. It's something that I'm learning, and if you are interested in learning about that technique, I'm going to have to defer to another YouTube channel from whom I am actually learning this technique, and that is Nick Page. Great photographer in the States. He does a lot of tutorials about luminosity masking. They're really easy to follow along, and it's where I'm learning this technique. So I'm going to put a card up to his channel. He's got a massive following, so he is really good and knows his stuff when it comes to Photoshop editing. In fact, I'm actually considering buying one of his courses into dodging and burning using luminosity masking, because he gets these amazing effects. So I hope that through these 5 tools, you can see how they can really affect your editing skill. They can really dramatically improve your images. They can bring out images where you screwed up in the field, like these images that I've took years ago, where the exposures were bad, the composition was bad, and everything else. But by using my editing knowledge that I've gained in the last few years, I was actually able to get an image back where I thought I didn't have an image anymore. I hope that from this very quick tutorial into these 5 tools, you've learned something about how they can be used, and hopefully you'll start experimenting with them in your own photography. That's obviously up to you. So if you've liked these 5 tools, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any suggestions for tips or tutorials that you want to go through in the future, write in the comments below and I will certainly look into it. And As always, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I am trying to build a channel and I want to keep providing useful content, and it's useful for me to know which videos work best for you guys as well. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've learned something from this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.